everyone, this is the third video in our Mario style platformer game that we're putting together in my class. In this particular game video we are going to be adding a parallax background. Now a parallax background is basically 3 layers of background images on top of each other, and they're moving at slightly different speeds. So if you take a look here, the foreground, the one that's closest to the player, or it's at least supposed to look that way, are these brighter trees here with the brown trunks. The mid-level are these whitish, grayish clouds, and then the final farthest background is this kind of forest scene with these stars and clouds back there. So they are scrolling at a slightly different pace than the platforms, and also from different paces from each other to give this illusion of kind of 3D-ishness. It's not really 3D yet, but it gives you that impression of, oops, I died, of like you're actually moving in a realistic landscape. Because as you guys know, hopefully from some basic art classes, is that when you are actually moving, the far background appears to be moving more slowly. Great. So one thing I want to say is that I'm going to do this with a class. There's nothing that requires you to do parallax backgrounds with classes. I just found it to be a lot easier to keep my code organized, to kind of think of it this way, and then also it's great practice to be working with classes. So each background, you've got the foreground, the middle ground, and the background, far background, has an X and Y position. It has a speed, X and Y speed, and then it also has a image attached to it. I probably could have gotten away with this class without even like including a Y velocity, because that doesn't change ever really. But this is ready to be altered for other directions, I suppose, for you then. We only have 3 functions here. We've got an initialize function, just like all of our other classes have had. We have a update function, and then we have a draw function, which you'll see in the render section. Lots of setup with this. The first thing you need to do is you actually need to create some Allegro variables to load in these image files. Then what we're going to do is we are going to put images in these image files. So let me kind of separate these 2 sections out here. This first chunk of code here is just loading images into the backgrounds and setting up their transparency. When you look at my images that I used for this with my fantastic MS Paint skills, I'm using this lovely toxic bright pink color. This is my favorite color, and a lot of people in the game industry use this color for transparency. Because it's so freaking ugly, you're not going to see this be used very often in your other sprites, so you don't really need to worry about making things transparent when you don't want them to be transparent, as opposed to like a common color like a black or a white or something like that. You risk you run the risk of actually making things transparent when you don't want them to be. So this is a really safe color to have as your background that you can then make transparent, and you definitely want some transparency here, because otherwise your foreground images are going to be covering up your background images. These are pretty darn big. I think this is like a 500, well, it's as tall as your game screen is, by 5,000 or something. So lots of copy pasting going on in Microsoft Paint to get that gorgeous image up for you guys. This second half of the setup here is actually working with the class now. So I'm stamping, I am instantiating those objects, so stamping that class to make 3 background images, or 3 background objects, I should say. So you've got background BG1, background BG2, just like in Breakout, brick B1, brick B2, brick B3, and so on. And then we right away, we initialize them. They're all initialized to start at 0, 0. The only real difference, besides obviously the pictures being loaded up differently, are these speeds. So the midground is moving at a speed of 1, and then relative to these, you've got the far background running at half that speed, and the close background, the foreground, the one that's closest to you, running at like twice that speed. And you can mess with these to get bigger effects. Okay, I'm actually going to skip talking about, like, I'll come back to this in just a second, how we use it in the timer section. I'm going to actually scroll all the way down. Here's the end of my main function. Here's my collision function. We talked about that in the last video. I'm going to go actually all the way down here to my class functions now, which have been added to this definition, this pile of definitions at the bottom of my code. So remember, these are class functions, so you have to add the class name plus this lovely little scope resolution operator right there. This should be old hat for you. Getting this initialization function, you're just taking whatever parameters you've passed up above the game loop when you called this function into the class variables there. So that should be easy peasy. Let me skip here. This is obviously just drawing it. We're drawing the bitmap, so that's easy too. Now here's the only part with a little bit of math, and as you can see, it's pretty simple math. So update background, all it's really doing is it's just adding whatever speed we're going at to our x position, and all this does, this is going to be a negative or a positive, and it's just going to flip the direction. So if we're that middle ground, that cloud layer, that's going to be adding or subtracting 1 every time we press down on the left or right key, and you'll see that in a second. And then if we switch directions, just this is multiplied to make it go the opposite direction. So I think it'll make a lot more sense when we actually look at it up here in the render section, or sorry, the timer section. So here we go, is let's start with these calls right here. So if the left-hand button is if the left arrow is being pressed, we're going to be basically subtracting 1 from our background images, and they're going to move across the screen. If we're going right, we're just going to go the opposite direction. We're going to be adding 1. Okay? So notice that these things here, all they're really doing is they're flipping the direction. I actually misspoke there a little bit. They're not moving at 1. They're moving at whatever velocity we set the velocity to be at. So the one that's moving 2 pixels per game, per time that it's called, is still moving 2 pixels, but this is just going to be like, am I moving 2 pixels to the right, or am I moving 2 pixels to the left? Up here, this guy actually just stops it. So when we are right here, if we've collided with a platform as we're moving left or right, we want to right away stop that scrolling motion, because otherwise it's not going to look right at all. So here you're just multiplying by 0, which basically turns the velocity into 0, which stops any kind of motion. So when you actually are hitting something to the side, you can see that effect here is, oh, actually isn't working so great with the foreground there, probably because of that like vibrating thing. So it's actually that bounce effect is having a negative impact on how it should be looking. But for the most part, it does mostly stop there. I suppose if we wanted to really fix that, we'd need to kind of take off how we handle our stopping when we're going left and right. Cool. All right. So that gets us at least mostly going with a parallax background. So the only calls you have here in the timer section, the only time you really mention it. Oh, one other thing I forgot to mention. When you die, you want to reset your backgrounds. And I just did this by calling the initializer function again. So when you're going through your timer section, the first time you see anything having to do with this background is here in the death section when you fall down a hole and reset the player's position. You also want to reset your background images. The next time you see it is when you're moving, when you collide in a left or right motion, we want to actually stop that movement. And this isn't working so great. I'll see if I can actually tweak that a little bit for the next video. Then you also see it getting updated here when you're moving left or right. This is kind of the main, most important call here because it's actually what moves it. And then, of course, the final thing is in the render section, you do want to draw each of the backgrounds. Now, please remember, order does matter. You really want it to be in this order. You want to draw the backgrounds, then you want to draw the map, the platforms, and then you want to draw the player. If you put your backgrounds in front of your platforms, obviously, they're going to cover them up. Okay, great. So hopefully this gets you rolling with a parallax background. Best of luck getting it to work.